Well, good morning. It is Monday, March 8th, and we are gathered for our morning devotion, again using N.T. Wright's Lent for Everybody. This passage is from Mark chapter 7, verses 1 through 13, and that is as well the focus. The Pharisees gathered around Jesus, together with some legal experts from Jerusalem. They saw that some of the disciples were eating their food with unclean, that is, unwashed hands. The Pharisees, you see, and indeed all the Jews, don't eat unless they first carefully wash their hands. This is to maintain the tradition of the elders. When they come in front of the market, they never eat without washing. There are many other traditions which they count, washing of cups, pots, and bronze dishes. Anyway, the Pharisees and legal experts asked Jesus, "Why don't your disciples follow the tradition of the elders? Why do they eat their food with unwashed hands?" "Isaiah summed you up just right," Jesus replied. "Hypocrites, a lot of you. What he said was this: with their lips, this people honor me, but with their hearts they turn away from me. All in vain they think to worship me. All they teach is human commands. You abandon God's commands and keep human tradition." So, he went on, "you have a fine way of setting aside God's commands so as to maintain your tradition. Here's an example. Moses said, 'Honor your father and your mother,' and anyone who slanders father and mother should die. But you say, if someone says to their father and mother what you might get from them, it's korban, which means given to God. You don't let them do anything else for their father or mother. The net result is that you invalidate God's words through the tradition which you hand on. And there are lots more like this for which you do." What we are saying is we were staying in a remote part of Scotland for a holiday. Our host welcomed us, pointed out that we don't need a door to the key, they never were locked. The risk of intruder or burglar in this part of the world were more or less nil. I reflected on other places we had stayed over the previous 4 years. In some parts of London, it takes you 2 to 3 keys to get into a house. One for the tall, secure outer door, another for the main front door, and a third for an inner door after that. Taking no chance, in some parts of the country, people are building new estates, almost whole villages, which have a secure perimeter fence and an outer gate which is staffed 24 hours a day. Some societies and cultures have been like that too. When we lived in Montreal, the French majority in the province of Quebec were fiercely protective of their culture. Hardly surprised, being as it was a French-speaking island in the middle of a massive English-speaking continent. They passed laws to force businesses to use French as their official documents, even when all the people concerned were English speakers. Looking back through history, many embattled peoples have done this equivalent. If our culture is distinct, many people will want to keep it that way, even at a cost, metaphorically speaking of triple locking your gates and doors. That protective locking in of a way of life is all the more important in the way of life in question has been given by God, which of course the ancient Jews believed theirs had been. They couldn't stop the Greeks and the Romans taking over the running of the country, but they could maintain their own way of life in their villages and home. This wasn't so much a matter of an official edict enforced by official police, as often in tight-knit and sensitive cultures, self-appointed guardians of public standards or gatekeepers, if you like, sprang up to watch out for anybody compromising and colluding with the paganisms of the surrounding world. That's where the Pharisees come in. They were, to the extent, a bit like a neighborhood watch committee, keeping an eye out for danger. And danger was what they thought they'd spotted. As in many cultures, a sense of need to protect the community from pollution is reflected in the heightening of the laws and codes of personal purity and hygiene. Obviously, a certain amount of hand washing made good sense in many cultures, but they elevated it to an art form and did their best to enforce it more because of what it symbolized than because of a concern for personal health. And Jesus and his followers chose to ignore that rule. As with the Sabbath observed, they cut clean through it. This raises two issues. First, what is the status of traditions that the Pharisees were trying to insist upon? And second, what then is the nature of true purity? The present passage focuses on the first, the next one on the second. In the present passage, Jesus deals with the underlying question. By what right are the Pharisees adding their traditions on top of what Scripture itself says? In fact, Jesus counterattacked. Instead of defending himself and his followers against the charge of impurity, he accused the Pharisees of inventing traditions that actually undermine the law itself. The example he gives is of a neat dodge that excuses a person from financial obligation to parents. Over the generation of Pharisees and their successors, the rabbis, developed a great deal of subtle case laws designed to make the official Torah more practical, but in some instances it seems actually undermining its original intentions. This is a delicate area because, as I had tried to show, the Pharisees' concern was not simply a matter of being legalistic, encouraging people to think that they could make themselves good enough for God by their good works. That is a much later problem. They were concerned rather to defend and preserve the God-given way of life handed down from their ancestors in obedience to God's covenant. The problem was, as Paul would later put it, the knowledge in question was the knowledge that came from Jesus, with his announcement of God's kingdom and with his saving death and resurrection. Something radically new was happening, something through which Israel's deepest calling and traditions were being fulfilled, but also in the process transformed. The Pharisees had tried to enforce other layers of tradition as well, were like people discussing the types of horses you should ride to get to London to Edinburgh when the railway had been invented and were offering a far more efficient mode of transportation. That was the basic issue, you see, and we see it again and again in the gospel. It isn't a matter of rules and regulations on the one side or anything goes or do your own thing on the other, as many today wrongly imagine. It is a matter of God's new initiative in and through Jesus. Like someone triumphantly putting the ceiling on the ground floor of a house they're building. This then creates a floor for the next story. Jesus was declaring by his actions as well as his words that the ground floor was complete and it was time to start work on the upper floor. Not because the ground floor was a failure, but because its job was done. And the view from upstairs would, in some respects, be significantly different. All this is basic to understanding what Jesus was doing and what Mark was saying. But of course, the same issue resonates through church and life in our every age. Are we paying attention to the foundation principles of our faith? Or are we allowing all kinds of extra traditions to grow up around them, which might actually undermine some of those foundation principles themselves? This is an old problem, but one that generations need to address every day. And so what's the point of what N.T. Wright is saying? So we have traditions in our faith and we have traditions in our church. And all he's simply saying is those traditions should not trump what we do in our worship service. They should not be more important than worshiping God. For instance, one of the golden calves in this church is the altar, which is sitting here on my left, which you can't see. And if the things aren't on there just right, because they were passed down from person to person to person to person, it becomes an issue. Another issue is, as I'm looking towards the camera right in front of me, there's a blanket covering a part of the stained glass windows to stop the reflection on the plexiglass as the band records. Well, those stained glass windows are a golden calf within this community. And if people were to come in and see that, there would be some issues. But that shouldn't be more important than why we are here. If the windows are covered up, 2 of them, is it that big of a deal? Is that more important than we are gathered together to worship God? And that's really what he was getting to in this passage, is our traditions that we think are sacred should not stand in our way of meeting God. And so as we're progressing through the study of Lent, you can see how this would affect Jesus' life. You can see how this was another step in the building up of Jesus working towards Good Friday, and how they would have used this against him in order to crucify him and kill him and put his teachings out. So this is just another step that Mark is using in his gospel to tell us why Jesus was crucified. Have a great day, everybody. We will see you tomorrow. Take care. Bye.